PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with the authors of books about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Scott Patchan about his book, George Washington and the French and Indian War.
This week on PA Books, Scott Patchan, author of George Washington in the French and Indian War.
Scott Patchan is the author of George Washington in the French and Indian War. And you say in the book that your grandparents lived in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and that as a kid you visited Fort Necessity, the Fort Necessity battlefield. What was that experience like for you?
Well, yeah, I'll tell you an interesting story of it. The first thing for me when I went there, I was really knew George Washington in the Revolutionary War. So it was kind of, when I saw all these reenactors, living historians in red coats, I was like, wait a minute, George Washington was with the Americans, they wore blue. So I was only about 5 years old at the time. But quickly took in, and one of the reenactors had me come up and take a picture with him there standing outside of the fort. And I can distinctly remember him. He had just done a firing demonstration, and he was just saying, "Don't touch the barrel, it's still hot." And but for me, that was the first time, going out there, walking on the remnants of the Braddock Road, being at that fort that Washington had constructed as a young man, and visiting Braddock's grave, just started off for me this passion that I have to visit battlefields and historic sites. And it was just something, that I always loved to do, just to be outside in the spring and fall. It's a great time of the year to visit these type of sites. So, that created a passion for me, that visit, the Fort Necessity National Battlefield back in the early 70s. And I kicked off all of my entire interest in history.
Today, the site is a national park. And if you're standing there today, there is a replica of the fort itself. But just describe, if you were to look around, describe the landscape for us.
Well, one of the things that as you get there and you realize that George Washington has kind of constructed his fort in the lowest part of the meadow, and where his opponents would have the high ground all around him. So you have this fort that's about 70 feet wide with about a 15 by 15 shed in the middle. And this fort was as much designed to keep the soldiers out of the provisions, which included rum, as it was to fight a battle there. When you're standing there and looking out at these hills that are covered with trees, and then when you see the modern signs that denote the tree line that was actually there historically, and you just see how close the French and Indians were able to get to that fort, you realize that he had yet to develop a lot of the military acumen there, because he really put himself at a disadvantage with the selection of that fort there. One of the things that you'll see is there's two sides. There's a stream coming in on two sides of the fort, and then there's trenches that they built on the outside, kind of looking to the south and west of the fort there. And you have to, when you're there, right now it's all nicely grass and lawn mowed, neatly trimmed, and the British flag is flying. But then when you start to think about what that scenario was like on July 4th of 1754, where it had rained continuously for the previous day or longer. And these men were literally in a quagmire of mud, and as the fighting and casualties mounted of blood building up in these trenches, and their weapons were fouling. So when you go there today, again, it's this pastoral setting, but you kind of have to use your imagination to put yourself in the mode of what it was like at that historic moment in 1754 for young George Washington in his first large military battle.
And George Washington was pretty young. The period that you talk about in the book, he's in his early 20s during much of this time. And you quote Peter Stark, a historian Peter Stark, saying, "Everything about Washington's life played out on a grander scale than most people's. Most people make mistakes as they mature and grow from them. Washington's missteps occurred in an arena that quickly expanded from local to regional and finally to global with far-reaching historical consequences." So at the start of this, he's 21 years old. Tell us about him. Who is he?
Well, Washington is growing up. His father died when he was 11 years old. And his older brother, Lawrence, kind of steps in and becomes the mentor for George Washington in his life. And Lawrence is a well-positioned man in the Virginia colony. During the War of Jenkins' Ear, he serves essentially as a captain of it was a Virginia military formation that Admiral Vernon, who's commanding the British fleet in the Caribbean at the time, has taken Washington's portion of that command on as kind of like a Marine detachment on his flagship. And although Lawrence Washington does not see much military action there, he'll get sick, and ultimately this will wear at him for the rest of his life. But George will lionize Lawrence. Lawrence also had, and his other older brother Augustine, had advantages that George would not. When his father was still alive, he sent the two older brothers to Great Britain to be educated for several years. George never had that opportunity for formal education. Lawrence would also later on become the head of the Virginia militia for the Northern Neck District. Lawrence would be the proprietor of what we know today as Mount Vernon. And when it would later be, the name would be Mount Vernon, named after Admiral Vernon that Lawrence had served under during his military career. As I said, Lawrence battled health problems, and at one point he would take George with him to the Caribbean in hopes that it would cure him. Doctors thought the warmer climate would be better for him. It did not do that. But it did expose Washington to the formality of the British garrisons there, the forts on the island, and he just kind of explored. And it also put him in touch with people in the term gentlemen of the time. And Washington learned a lot about British society there. They would return to Virginia, but by later, the summer of 1752, Lawrence would die. His wife would take over Mount Vernon, and eventually Washington would inherit that and take charge of that. Another thing that's important to know about Washington in his youth is that in the late 1740s, he was well connected with the Fairfax family. Washington was living with his brother Lawrence at that point, and he had become acquainted with the Fairfaxes who lived nearby at their estate in Fairfax County. And their Lord Fairfax, the head of this family, lived out in the Shenandoah Valley, about 15 miles southeast of Winchester, at a place called Greenway Court. And Lord Fairfax controlled vast acreages all across Northern Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, into what's now West Virginia and beyond. And so he controlled that, and that land needed to be surveyed. And so it's his connection with the Fairfax family that he would head west with them in the late 1740s and survey much of this land. He would pick up and own. He would have, by the time the French and Indian War breaks out, he's already going to own thousands of acres of land in the Shenandoah Valley that he had picked up as part of his surveying out there. But what's important is he gets to know a lot of this land out there and the ways out there. It gives him his first experience of meeting with American Indians during this time. An interesting story about him is, he goes out there one of the first nights, and he stays at a house, and he's really kind of disgusted. He gets in and he gets body lice and things, and he learned a lesson. He said, from now on, I'll be staying and sleeping by the campfire and won't be crawling into any of these. So it was a rough experience for young Washington, who in the day had grown up in relatively well-off nature in Virginia for that time period. Washington, he would eventually, shortly before he would embark on a mission for Governor Dinwiddie, he would get one of the commissions be the major in charge of a section of the Virginia militia. A lot of you might think that this carries a lot of military experience and training inherent in it, but it was largely more of a symbolic title, and they often had difficulty getting calling the men out for militia musters and things. But it was something that did give Washington more, I would say, in terms of his position in the colony of Virginia, and brought him onto the radar of Governor Dinwiddie.
Now, the key events that you talk about in the book all revolve around the question of who would control the forks of the Ohio. Now, today, there is a city there, Pittsburgh, but at that time, there was no city there. So why were the forks of the Ohio so important?
Well, the forks of the Ohio, that's where the Allegheny River flows into the modern Pittsburgh area from the north. The Monongahela comes out from the south, and the two join there at the forks of the Ohio at Point State Park in modern Pittsburgh to form the Ohio River, which then heads off to the southwest and goes through the north of Kentucky and the southern tier of Midwestern states, Ohio, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, until it joins the Mississippi River. So it's a vital transportation artery. But from Virginia's perspective, they had formed what was known as the Ohio Company. A lot of prominent Virginians were stockholders and important figures in this venture, including both of Washington's older brothers, Lawrence and Augustine, George Mason, Dinwiddie, and others. And one of the things that distinguished them from some other competing companies trying to settle that land was that they had the royal charter from the King George II of Great Britain. So they kind of had the leg up. But they had to get out there and they had to start settling. And they had to get so many families on that land and a fort constructed at the forks before they would open up the entire section for them. So they start in the late 1740s and early 1750s, blazing a road out there towards that area. Surveying, Christopher Gist did large travels through Ohio, Kentucky, what's now West Virginia and Western Maryland and southwestern Pennsylvania to actually survey that territory on behalf of the Ohio Company. And, as things are going to work, the French, I'll get into a little bit, the English kind of staked their claim on that territory on the fact that after a prior war with the French, it ended in the early 1700s, the French recognized the British suzerainty over the Iroquois League. And the Iroquois League had claimed that section of Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Western Maryland as because they had defeated the Indians who were the primary residents there, who were the Delaware and the Shawnee. And so British kind of hung their hats on that treaty. And the French claimed that the early exploration of French explorers through that region had given them the rights to that country. Another thing that's important to look at here is when I like to point out to people is differences between the British colonies and the French colonies. First of all, on the eve of the French and Indian War, there was less than 100,000 Europeans living in the French Canada. There was over 1 million British colonists at that point. One of the things, and I think the Indians had recognized this, the British were land hungry. They were looking to settle, do business, put down roots. And whereas the French were very much more into trade, trapping, and the fur trade. So they had the French had also established long-term relationships with many of the tribes, especially a lot of those in the upper Great Lakes. And just the French seem to have better relationships at that point. And that's going to be one of Washington's initiatives, is to, hey, go out there and try and make friends with some of the local Native Americans and bring them into our camp.
Now, Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia would eventually tap George Washington as a 21-year-old to go on a diplomatic mission to the French, who were in the process of building forts along the Allegheny River. What was the situation there, and what was George Washington's experience like?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of the lead up on that too, is, the French by late 1740s are sending out the Celeron expedition, and he leads a military detachment, and he's strategically burying some lead plates at key tributaries and points along the Ohio River, in an old European custom to mark out your territory. Which largely went ignored by the British at that point. The British continue to make inroads, establishing trading posts at Pickawillany and Logstown. And the French were fearful of that, because they were starting to make inroads with some of their traditional allies, including the Miami tribe, which is out with Pickawillany, which is at modern Piqua, Ohio. And in the summer of 1752, the French would lead a party down that consisted largely of their Native American allies from the upper Great Lakes region, and they would attack Pickawillany and the trading post there. And most of the Native American warriors were out and away, and so it was mostly women, children, and some elderly men. So they'd easily overrun this. They would kill one English trader and then cut out his heart and eat it. They actually boiled an elderly Miami chief alive and ate him, as a sign of warning to the other Indian tribes what would be in store for them if they got too close to the British there. And that's going to set off some concern for Governor Dinwiddie. Dinwiddie is going to be concerned, what can he do to assist these people that he was trying to lure into his orbit, but yet he had to be careful because there was a state of peace between Great Britain and France, so he could not go too far. Ultimately, in the case of the Miamis, he's not going to be able to do anything, and they will return to the French orbit, because they could not count on any support from the English at that point. And so as 1752 goes on and 1753 arrives, the French decide that they are going to build a series of forts coming down from what's now Erie, Pennsylvania, down along the Allegheny River towards Pittsburgh and some of its tributaries. It'd be 3 forts, and they would drive out. One of the forts was actually a trading post of Trader John Fraser, and they would turn that and occupy it as a fort. And so Dinwiddie's getting a little nervous at what's going on there. He had his own plans to build a fort at the forks of the Ohio. Dinwiddie's communicating with King George II. He lets them know that this is a matter of the most tender interest here, and very important that the British react to this. And so he decides by the fall of 1753 that Major George Washington, 21 years old at that point, is going to lead a purely diplomatic mission out to these French forts. He's going to have Christopher Gist, a noted frontiersman who had surveyed the Ohio country previously for the Virginians. And one of his initiatives is going to be go out there and recruit a force of the American Indians that are out there. And again, stated earlier that the tribes that lived out there in the largest numbers, the preponderance, are Shawnee and Delaware. And the Native Americans are on the fence. They're going to be impressed. They don't want to jump in side with the losers. So when they're going to be looking for a show of strength. And so Washington's trying to show them that the British are serious about getting out there in what's now Western Pennsylvania region. And one of the things that's out there is you have a couple of chiefs from the Iroquois League who are known as half-kings. And the primary one that's going to be interfacing throughout this period of time is Tanagreeson, and he's simply known as the half-king in a lot of the accounts. And he is kind of like the overlord of there. Of course, he doesn't have a lot to say. The Shawnee and Delaware know that the Iroquois, who are primarily based in upstate near New York, that that's who they're ultimately in control with. But in terms of direct power, he doesn't have it. So the Half King, he's trying to maintain a balance of power so that he can maintain his power over the local tribes, and at the same time walk a fine line between the British and French. But he also has a personal vendetta. He had learned, and from his understanding was that the French had killed his father and boiled and ate his heart, and so he was really trying hard to get the English to come out there and drive the French out of the territory. So at the backdrop here, the Half King has his own motives as young George Washington comes onto the scene. Now, when he's out there in the fall of 1753, the Half King promises support, but really only ends up with a handful of warriors that will accompany him to the French forts. When Washington gets to the first French fort in November, he's going to be told he's got to go farther north to the next fort there. And then he will arrive there and he'll be told that the French commander, Captain Lagardiere, who was a French Marine with 30 years of experience, that he would be along shortly in a couple of days. And so when he arrives, Washington delivers his message. And that message was essentially Governor Dinwiddie telling the French, you are on British territory and you need to leave. Obviously, the French, they took this under advisements and got their interpreters and looked at it, and the response was exactly as one might expect. The French have hundreds of men out there. And another aspect of Washington's mission was where Dinwiddie had asked him, he said, hey, I want you to look at their forts, take note of what their forts are like, how they're garrisoned, and what does it appear to be that their intentions are on. Gain as much information. So Washington was spying on the French while he's waiting for their formal reply to Governor Dinwiddie's message. And so he will, after a few days there, the British will also be attempting to woo the Half King into their orbit, giving him gifts, intoxicating him. And, Washington's going to kind of drag him out of there and say, hey, we're headed out of here. Along the way back, there'd be a couple of incidents. There would be a hostile Indian they would encounter. He would walk through a snowstorm with Gist and Washington. At one point, he's going to take a pot shot at them and miss, and they will disarm him, but they will let him go, and then they'll just hurry on. They're coming down the Allegheny River towards the forks of the Ohio. At one point, it's icy and water's rough, and they're on a raft, and Washington would literally fall off of the raft, and they literally be saved, have to be taken ashore, start fires to dry off. They would also meet another Native American leader, and that would be Queen Aliquippa, one of the Seneca or Mingo tribe that were more tightly from the Iroquois League. They were out in that area because that area was the Seneca's traditional hunting ground, but a number of them had started to stay on and live in there permanently among the Delaware and the Shawnee. He'll get back to Williamsburg in early January of 1754, deliver the French refusal to vacate, and that stating that this is their land and how dare they pretend to do this. So what's going to happen in early 1754 is Dinwiddie's going to form the Virginia Regiment. And Washington lobbies. He does not want command. He acknowledges that he's much too young for that, but what he hoped would be like to serve as the lieutenant colonel or second in command of the regiment under a more senior man, educated and seasoned than himself, that he could learn from. And that's going to be Colonel Joshua Fry. But back up a bit, and Dinwiddie is also going to assign in early 1754 Captain Trent to take a company of men out to the forks of the Ohio and begin constructing a fort there. Now, it's ironic, when Washington had passed by this site in late 1753 on his way to visit the French, he noted that it was a poor site for a fort, and he had noticed that the site that the French would later pick to build Fort Duquesne would have been his preferred site as well. So Trent's going to go on ahead in late February and March and get to the forks of the Ohio, and he will be working on constructing the British presence at the forks of the Ohio.
Well, let me ask you, I just wanted to ask you about, since Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie is kind of the driving force behind a lot of these actions, how much influence or how much knowledge does the British government in London have of these actions?
Well, Dinwiddie has been communicating with them going back into 1753. And interestingly enough, one of Dinwiddie's biggest impediments is more the Virginia House of Burgesses, who does not want to fund these expeditions to the extent that Dinwiddie is like. And some of that had to do with some other disputes, other issues that he had, so they would not give in to Dinwiddie on this. So again, this whole expedition and everything is going to be heading out there into the Ohio country on a shoestring budget as well. And that's going to impact logistics. Logistics is going to be important for Washington as he's moving forward. But I think one thing, getting back to Governor Dinwiddie, is a lot of us, when we learn about this, we look at this just as this is George Washington out there. He's the father of our country, the victor of the American Revolution and things. But remember, Washington ultimately becomes the tool of Dinwiddie in executing the policy in the Ohio country. But now let's talk what happens. Colonel Fry, the official commander, is going to be kind of in the rear trying to get part of it up. Washington's forces up in Alexandria are going to be ready to go in early April. He's going to have about 160 men, and he's going to head out through the Shenandoah Valley, out through what's now Romney, West Virginia, up to Cumberland, and then be heading out towards what's now southwestern Pennsylvania region. And Fry is very slow in moving forward there. It's interesting that, young Washington does a credible job of getting his force, and that he ends up waiting for the colonel. And I'll talk more about that later on. But one of the things, too, that's important here is the caliber of the recruits that they are getting to join the Virginia regiment was not what they had hoped. Pay was relatively low. The militia did not want to turn out as ordered to participate in this. Another issue that would soon come to Washington's attention was that if you're a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia regiment, you are subservient to officers who receive their commission from the King of England. So anybody in the British regular army, captains, which will soon be coming on, Washington cannot command them, and they are not beholden to follow any orders from Washington. And we'll talk some more about that in a little bit. So that's going to create some consternation amongst the officer corps as Washington's heading out towards his dates with destiny at Jumonville and Fort Necessity.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
So as some of these actions are taking place, there's a series of actions and reactions between the French and the British. What was the French reaction to Washington's visit? Did it change what they were doing?
Well, the French are building up. So as he is moving out there, he's going to get word. What actually happens there towards late March, early April, the French, a large force, about 800 men by some sources. Some of the British claim 1,200 Frenchmen. I think that's rather on the high side, but they had a number of artillery. This is comes sailing down the Allegheny River to the forks of the Ohio, where this fort has just been put under construction. And there you have Captain Trent and the Half King Tanagreeson there, and they are going to, bring their artillery out and demand the surrender of the fort. Trent is going to get an hour to assess the situation. He's going to confer with the Half King. Now the Half King's telling him to refuse. You can't give in to these French. And Trent, who's got a handful of about 40 men. Actually, Trent has already left, and he's gone out looking for supplies because their food is running out. And so it's the third in command that's actually there. And this ensign who's there and goes and surrenders to the French. And the French, they invite him to dinner, and then he has to leave the next day and starts moving back. And as Washington's moving up towards Cumberland, what's now Cumberland, it was called Wills Creek at the time, and there was a small blockhouse or storehouse known as Fort Ohio that the Ohio Company had constructed there. So that's going to kind of be his kickoff point for his expedition as they get closer to that western PA region. Washington's going to get word from a messenger and that the French have taken the fort. Now, one of the things about that's important, if you're Washington, again, you were supposed to be second in command, but suddenly you're out here on the frontier and things start happening. Well, he has orders from Dinwiddie that essentially say that if anybody interferes with our works, the works meaning the fort, or our settlements, then you are to capture and make prisoners of them or kill and destroy them. It said, for the rest, you are to act in the best interest of the service and the furtherance of His Majesty's service as well. So Washington at that point has seen a hostile action where the French used overt military force to force Trent's party away from the forks of the Ohio. So Washington at that point is, in his mind, he's seeing the French as an adversary. Now, what's important to know is that, the formalities there, the King of France and the King of England were at peace with each other officially at this point. The prior French and Indian wars that had ended in 1702 and 1748 had failed to formally delineate the borders between the French and the English claims in that Ohio country. So Washington is going to begin moving westward. And by the later portion of May of 1754, it's going to find him situated at the Great Meadows, which is the site of Fort Necessity.
So let's talk about the actions that he's taking out there. So they start patrolling and getting reports about locations of the French. At what point does he encounter the French for the first time?
Yes. So on May 23rd, the French, who by this time are well underway and constructed Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio, which you can visit today, the site. It's outlined there at Point State Park in Pittsburgh. On May 23rd, Captain Contrecoeur, the French commander, is going to send out a company of troops de la Marine under the command of Ensign Jumonville. Jumonville comes from a prominent French-Canadian military family. Just a little brief history of the French Marines were the military force that was assigned to the defense of the colony, and they had grown almost into somewhat of a hereditary structure with fathers and sons serving together and passing commands on. And Jumonville's father and his brothers had all been very active in the French military forces prior to the French and Indian War. On May 23rd, Jumonville is going to be sent out from Fort Duquesne because the Native Americans had reported back to the French that there was a French party, a British party encroaching on French territory. So they send this ensign out there. Now he's with a fully armed company of French troops, And he has a message, though, very much similar to the one that Washington carried to the French the previous year. This is our land, and you English are intruding upon French settlements, and you need to leave and go back to the other side of the mountains. But at the same time, the commander had told Jumonville, when you locate them, send a pair of fast legs back to the fort before you make communications with them to let us know what's going on. So a lot of historians have taken that to mean that, they were going to send more troops out there once he was actually located, but we don't know for sure. So by the 28th of May, in 1754, this small French force is ensconced in a small glen with a steep rock escarpment and pouring rain. They're encamped there. The previous evening, they had raided the settlement of Christopher Gist, which is near Uniontown, Pennsylvania today, kind of just down the side of the mountain from where this what's known as Jumonville Glen is today. And Gist reports back to Washington at the Great Meadows earlier in the day of May 28th, and it happens to be a couple of young warriors from the Half Kings party. Now, the Half Kings only got about a dozen men total, including himself, so it's not a very large force. Washington's first reaction, he's going to send half his troops out under the command of a captain toward Gist settlement to try and locate this French party. And in all likelihood, it seems that they marched right past him. He was camped a few miles off into the woods, and they miss him. So Washington's only got about half of his force with him. And he does send runners back from these young warriors back to the Half Kings encampment, about a half dozen miles away from the fort site, and tells them that the French are there and they want to kill the Half King. And now that's kind of Washington stretching it to get the Native Americans fired up to want to join him and go out after this French party. Now, prior to this, the Half King had reported to Washington, that, quote, the French army is out looking for Mr. George Washington. So as that day goes on, the Half Kings party is going to locate the French ensconced in the woods. And that evening of May 28th, a runner is going to go to Washington's camp at the Great Meadows and inform him that they have located it. So Washington's going to take 40 men on a night march, pouring rain, going through the woods till they get to the Half Kings encampment, which is today known as the Half Kings Rock, a few miles away from where the French lay encamped. And they will agree. Now, it's an interesting consultation or dynamic upon the meeting of the two men. Of course, Washington thinks he's in charge. And, Washington is there. He's motivated by his orders that the French have taken the British fort, and that's his orders now to go out and punish these offenders. The Half King, so much, he's got a different set. He wants to pull the French into conflict with the British in the Ohio country. He also has his personal vendetta against the French. And so although these men would go forward as allies, they're going through with vastly different motivations. And it's interesting, Dr. David Preston had found an excellent source on this encounter in his book on Braddock's battle. And where the Indians are actually telling, it's like when they get to the site of where the French are encamped, they're telling Washington how to deploy his troops and where they're going to be. So they are going to arrive at the French encampment without being detected. About 8 o'clock the next morning, the French are up. They're, waking up, getting ready to start the day, eating breakfast. Some are shaving. And Washington positions his troops around on, the sides of the glen. And other Native American parties would block off the far northern end of that area, which was the only ready means of escape that the French would have. Sometimes it's somewhat of a controversy over who fired the first shot there. Was it Washington's men launching the attack, or was it French detecting them and opening fire? But I think the most important thing is here, we clearly have George Washington engaged in an offensive military operation against Jumonville's party. But Jumonville, they're going to open fire. The Native Americans claim that Washington himself fires the first shot as a signal to his men to begin the attack. And the French are going to start retreating out the northern end of that ravine, but they are quickly going to be blocked by the attack of the Half King and his dozen or so warriors that are blocking them. And the French will come running back towards Washington, and to whom they will attempt to surrender. The Half King's party, they will already start wounded French, scalping and killing them. And Jumonville himself, in a very confused scene of which there's multiple versions of how it actually goes down, it's clear that Jumonville's trying to, through an interpreter, tell Washington that he's there on a diplomatic mission and trying to get his message across. When the Half King arrives up at that spot, and he will literally scalp him, break open his skull, pull his brains out. And as one of the onlooking soldiers of Washington's command describes it, that he washed his hands in Jumonville's brains. And at that point, Washington has lost control of the situation, and he's going to have to calm down his Native American allies. And he finally convinces them that they've got enough trophies in the form of scalps and killed. It's interesting, in this small battle, Washington would have one man killed and a couple others wounded. The French would have about 12, 13 men shot, and of those, only one survived. The rest were all killed, probably because they had been scalped and mutilated by Washington's allies.
Now, the French would respond to this by sending out another expedition, a punitive expedition, and this would eventually lead to the battle at Fort Necessity. As the French are coming into the area where the fort is located, what is Washington's defensive positions like?
Well, yes, Washington at that point, he's been reinforced. This is important to note. He has a company of about 100 British regulars, an independent company that had been in South Carolina and had come up and joined him. There was also the other detachment under Colonel Fry has joined him. Unfortunately, Fry, about the same, right at the end of May of 1754, Fry would fall off his horse in Cumberland, and he would die from this. And so that's going to place Washington in full command of the Virginia Regiment in the situation. However, I mentioned before, the captain there of the British regulars does not see himself as subservient to Washington. In fact, he doesn't even want to share passwords. Washington's trying to share passwords and set up security around the perimeters. And the regulars kind of went off and set up their own encampment and let Washington to his own devices. To the credit of the British commander, though, he would, as soon as the French begin approaching towards them, be very cooperative once the action starts on the 4th of July. The French approaching there would be about 500 French Marines and Canadian militiamen, and at least 100 or more Native American troops that had out there. Some sources place the French and Indian combined strength at 900 or so men. But they're going to approach through the rain, the storm that's going to be letting up. But they go by the site on their way to Fort Necessity. They go by the site of where young Jumonville had been killed and properly buried, and said prayers over the graves of the fallen Frenchmen there. And I'm sure that steeled the command. The commander of this fort, Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers, is the older brother of Jumonville. So it was personal for him. He had requested permission. He just arrived at the fort as the Contrecoeur was getting this retaliatory force ready to go after Washington. And so He's going to come up in the morning of July 4th. By late morning, there'll be some picket firing before that for several hours. But then he's going to attempt to approach the fort. He's going to be kind of misaligned in his angle of approach, but then eventually he will get his troops all out there. Washington would attempt to advance the troops forward to meet the French. Interestingly enough, he's leading the regulars forward, and the British colonial forces from the Virginia Regiment, are supposed to follow, but the man who took over the second in command went back into the fort area, and the rest of the Virginians chose to follow him. And so Washington, instead of moving out to face the French in open field, is going to be forced to fall back with the regulars to the entrenchments and the fort. Now, as I said before, this is muddy, muck, a lot of rain coming down, the fire. So the French, for the most part, there'll be a couple of sorties that they'll make, but then they're going to back off, and they will just slowly encircle Washington at Fort Necessity until later in the evening. There'd be expended fire. Washington's men are running out of ammunition. Because it's so wet, they don't have the proper tools for extricating the musket balls that are stuck in the muskets so that they could clean them out and dry them. And so they're unable to maintain a defense. But then about 8 o'clock that evening, in a big surprise to Washington and his command, the French call out and ask if they want to parley. And first, Washington does not believe them. He thinks this is some kind of a French ruse. And of course, they would call out again. And so he would send out an officer, an interpreter who spoke French, to go and meet and see what the French wanted. Well, the French come up with this document, a surrender that would allow Washington basically to escape with his life and most of his pride and with military honors, to march out of there the next morning after some haggling back and forth. One of the key things in this surrender document, however, that Washington signs off on is an acknowledgement of the assassination of Ensign Jumonville. Washington would claim that by the candlelight and the rain smearing all the ink and everything, and he would also strongly blame his own interpreter for failing to explain him to that adequately, that they were signing acknowledgement of an assassination. He would be leaving there, but that would be a big controversial issue, is that he had admitted to the assassination there. Did he know that at the time? We'll never know. But with that large force, and with Washington having recently witnessed firsthand what the Native Americans were capable of in the aftermath of an engagement, he gets out of there while he can. Again, it will surface and be a controversy, or pop up later on. Washington's journal would be left behind, and the French would get a hold of it and publish it in some of his accounts. And some of Washington's writings would come back and be less than flattering on him there. Washington would maintain that, some of those passages were edited by the French for publication to portray him in the worst possible light. So Washington, out of 400 men who were there, 100 of them would be killed or wounded. And he would leave with his troops and depart for Cumberland or Wills Creek, the defeated man.
Now, your book covers a lot of territory. You talk about Braddock's march and the Battle of Monongahela, George Washington's time on the frontier in Virginia, as well as Brigadier General John Forbes' campaign that would eventually be successful in capturing Fort Duquesne. But I wanted to kind of touch on just a few things before we wrap up. So after this Fort Necessity defeat, later Braddock would arrive and start to organize his expedition, and he would offer George Washington an opportunity to be a staff officer. So given George Washington's perhaps reputation based upon this defeat, why did Braddock reach out to him to be a staff officer?
Yeah, well, I think it's important that, Washington's going to resign ultimately because of seniority and other things. too much to get into here. And but in spite of this, he was still well respected in the Virginia colony, and I think somewhat looked upon a guy who went out there against long odds and did the best that he could, outnumbered, no food for his men, lack of logistical support. So his reputation survived intact. But again, I think one of the things that doesn't reflect well on him is his resigning and threatening to resign, which will be a constant throughout his French and Indian War career there. But so he's well looked upon, and it seems pretty obvious that somebody, probably Governor Dinwiddie, who seemed to look out for Washington in spite of sometimes what seems to me to be a lack of appreciation on Washington's part for what Dinwiddie has done for him. And so Braddock reaches out to him. Braddock wants somebody who's been out there, and who else is there in the Virginia colony that's he's got the position. He went out there in 1754. He had been some of that areas and his mission to visit the French. So he was a very important figure for Braddock in terms of providing information to him as he was planning his massive campaign in 1755.
So as a staff officer, he kind of had the freedom to observe how Braddock operated. He didn't have the responsibility that he had the previous time that he was there. So how did he take to that kind of observer role as a staff officer?
It's interesting, he's writing back, he's sharing some of his observations with his younger brother Jack, is what's going on. He doesn't have the responsibility, but he's going to get very sick shortly after, and then the campaign gets underway, and then he'll rush and join Braddock just before the battle happens. So he seemed to, one of the things there is that he got to meet a lot of important figures in the British military establishment at the time, in the Army, as well as other people in the colonies there, and establishes some relationships there. And without the stress of command and the situation being the guy responsible for everything as he was in 1754.
Now, the details of the Battle of Monongahela can be extensive, and we could do an entire show on that. But Braddock's forces would be defeated by a combined French and Indian force. How did this affect George Washington? He would return then to Virginia, and how was his performance perceived?
Well, Washington's, first of all, some of his performance has been exaggerated for his role of what exactly he did do there. But he's going to be the last staff officer standing for Braddock, and will be with him when he's wounded, and will assist in getting him off the battlefield and carrying out orders to move beyond. And they'd left part of the army not too far from Fort Necessity when a flying column went on to fight the battle, and to warn them what had happened and to prepare them. And so Washington carried that out, and then he will go back to Virginia, and ultimately he will be put in command of the Virginia Regiment again, and doing what he can to defend the western frontier of Virginia against French and Indian excursions.
Now, you say about him, you say that Washington remained thin-skinned to any criticism, real or perceived, and his correspondence does not reflect well on his professionalism and maturity. He was a young man going through a lot of events, and as we said in the beginning, he was going through his youthful mistakes, but on a grand scale. So what do you take away from him as a commander during this period?
Well, I think 1754 is the most important, because he's at the point. He is the leader of that expedition there, and he's acting under his orders. He has no experience whatsoever to call upon. In 1758, you see him communicating with the governor of Virginia and other influential Virginians and some his patrons, very critical of the preparations that they have. He basically wants them to use the Braddock Road and go with the way that Washington had been so involved with in 54 and 55. And Forbes is very patient. Forbes is moving slowly. He's taking his forces straight across Pennsylvania from Carlisle, Fort Ligonier. And he's also working a diplomatic angle, which proves critical to the success. The Treaty of Easton is going to pull a lot of the local Native Americans out of the French alliance, and that's going to be where things start to go south. Farther to the north, other British military actions are going to cut their upstate New York, cut British supply lines, so that the situation for Fort Duquesne is going to become tenuous, and the French will ultimately abandon it without a fight, and Forbes will simply occupy it.
Well,
and it's interesting, Washington would, in the end, he would acknowledge the methods that Forbes had used had led to success. So I think he definitely learned a lot there in 1758. And shortly after that successful campaign concluded in November, he returned to Virginia and marry Martha Custis and go about being a private citizen until 1775.
Well, we've been speaking with Scott Patchan. He is the author of George Washington in the French and Indian War. Scott, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.